In the summer of 1944, as the world focused on the beaches of Normandy, another story was quietly unfolding far to the south, a story that would shape the end of the Second World War. Yet for decades, it remained buried in the shadows of history. It was called Operation Dragoon, the forgotten invasion of southern France. When people speak of D-Day, they speak of Omaha, of Utah, of the blood and the glory of Normandy. But few remember that just weeks later, another armada, nearly as massive, was preparing to strike the southern coast of France, led primarily by American forces, supported by the Free French. This operation was meant to crush the German defenses from below, cutting off their retreat and freeing the rest of France. The soldiers who would land on those beaches had no illusions of fame. They knew they would fight a war that history might overlook. But they went anyway, because victory was not measured in headlines. It was measured in the freedom of people, in the hope of nations, and in the promise that tyranny would fall. Southern France in August 1944 was a place of beauty and fear. The vineyards and blue skies hid the scars of occupation. German fortifications stretched along the Mediterranean coast, and French resistance fighters, scattered and hunted, waited for the moment the Allies would return. And so, while the world celebrated the liberation of Paris, American generals like Alexander Patch, Jacob Devers, and Admiral Hewitt quietly prepared an invasion that would shock the enemy from an unexpected direction. It was a daring gamble to open another front in France when resources were already stretched thin, but for the Americans, it was more than strategy. It was about redemption, to prove that liberty could strike from every shore. The plan was simple on paper but deadly in execution. 3 American divisions would land on the beaches of the Côte d'Azur. Supported by airstrikes and paratroopers, the French forces would follow behind, liberating towns and reuniting a nation torn apart. As dawn approached on August 15, 1944, the silence over the Mediterranean broke with the sound of engines. The horizon filled with ships, thousands of them, carrying men who knew that this invasion, though forgotten by time, would decide the speed of Germany's defeat. For the Americans, this was their second D-Day, a chance to strike again for freedom, a chance to prove that the courage of Normandy was not an exception, but a standard. And as the first waves prepared to land, a new chapter in the war was about to begin, one that would test not only their strength, but the soul of the Allied fight for Europe. The morning of August 15, 1944, arrived with a silence that lasted only seconds before the thunder began. From the decks of American battleships, the sea exploded with artillery fire. Waves of landing craft surged forward, cutting through the Mediterranean like blades of steel. Operation Dragoon was in motion. 3 American divisions, the 3rd, the 45th, and the 36th, along with French troops, moved toward the beaches named Alpha, Delta, and Camel, each stretch of sand guarded by German artillery and machine gun nests hidden in the rocky hills. As the first landing craft opened their ramps, the air filled with gunfire. Sand flew like dust storms. Men shouted commands drowned by the roar of engines and explosions. Yet the Americans advanced, inch by inch, pulling the wounded, covering their brothers, refusing to stop. The beaches near Saint-Tropez, Saint-Raphael, and Cavalier became scenes of both chaos and courage. Medics running through waves, flags rising through smoke. American officers shouting into radios while the ships offshore poured fire into German defenses. For many of the soldiers, this was their second invasion. They had survived Normandy, and now they faced another test. The difference this time was confidence, experience, and overwhelming firepower. By midday, the German line had begun to crumble. Behind the beaches, French resistance fighters rose from the shadows. They attacked German convoys, sabotaged communication lines, and guided American paratroopers dropped inland during the night. The cooperation between the Americans and the French underground was a symbol of unity that Europe had not seen in years. By the end of the first day, the Americans had secured their beachheads with fewer casualties than expected. Their coordination, precision, and air support had stunned the German defenders, who were already weakened and low on supplies after months of retreat from the north. American General Alexander Patch directed his forces inland with calm determination. His orders were simple: move fast, link up with the French, cut off the German escape routes, and liberate as many towns as possible before they could regroup. In the towns and villages of southern France, bells began to ring. People came out from hiding waving the tricolor flag. Tears mixed with joy as they saw American and French soldiers marching side by side through the streets that had been silent for years. For the Americans, this victory was not just military, it was moral. They were welcomed as saviors, not conquerors. Their strength carried the promise that Europe would soon be free. As night fell on the first day of Operation Dragoon, the beaches of southern France glowed with fires and flares. The sound of engines never stopped. Supply ships unloaded tanks, jeeps, and ammunition, while the wounded were carried to hospital ships waiting offshore. The invasion had succeeded, but the mission was far from over. The Americans knew that the next challenge lay ahead: the pursuit through the mountains of Provence and the race to link up with the forces advancing from Normandy. In the distance, the Germans were already retreating, their commanders confused, their lines broken, and their morale shattered. The men of the United States Army had turned the tide of war once again, and the forgotten invasion of southern France had become a symbol of silent determination, a story of strength that would one day demand to be remembered. The roads of southern France filled with the sound of engines, the thunder of tanks, and the cheers of liberation. The American Seventh Army, led by General Alexander Patch, pushed north with incredible speed, their vehicles covered in dust and flags fluttering against the summer wind. French resistance fighters guided them through villages and back roads, pointing out German ambushes, showing hidden paths, and in many towns, they joined the battle themselves, armed with old rifles and endless courage. They fought not just for victory, but for home. As the Americans advanced, they entered towns that had suffered years under occupation. People came running from cellars and barns, crying, waving flags, and offering wine, bread, and flowers. Children climbed on tanks, smiling at soldiers who smiled back. Tired but proud, in the city of Toulon, the French forces under General de Lattre de Tassigny fought fiercely to reclaim their port. American artillery supported them from the hills. The city burned, smoke rose to the skies, but after days of brutal combat, the tricolor flag once again flew over the harbor. The liberation of Toulon and Marseille was more than a military win. It was a rebirth. Two of France's most important ports were free, and within days, American engineers were unloading thousands of tons of supplies that would fuel the Allied push toward Germany. The plan had worked perfectly. While the Germans still fought in northern France against the Normandy forces, Operation Dragoon had cut through the south, trapping German divisions between two powerful Allied armies, their escape routes closing like a tightening fist. For the United States, this campaign proved their might and precision. Their coordination between sea, air, and land was unmatched. Every village liberated carried stories of sacrifice, of friendship, of moments where humanity shone brighter than war itself. In Arles, Avignon, and Grenoble, church bells rang as columns of American jeeps rolled through the narrow streets. People shouted "Vive l'Amérique," soldiers handed candy to children, and local musicians played songs that had been banned under German rule. It was history unfolding in real time. And though many of the soldiers would never be remembered by name, their courage became part of the soil of France itself. Every mile they advanced was another wound healed, another hope reborn. By the end of August 1944, the American and French forces had advanced nearly 200 miles, linking up with General Patton's Third Army moving east from Normandy. The link was complete, and France was nearly free. The forgotten invasion had now become one of the most successful operations of the war. Yet even as the cities celebrated, the soldiers knew the fight was not over. Across the Rhine River, Germany still stood armed and defiant. The Americans who had landed on the southern shores looked north and knew their journey was not finished. They had freed a nation, but they still had to end a war. The road ahead led straight to the heart of darkness, and they were ready to face it. Their mission had gone beyond strategy. It had become a story of liberation, of unity, and of the power of a nation that refused to stop until the world was free again. When the guns finally fell silent in the hills of Provence, the men who had fought there looked around at the land they had freed. Olive groves scarred by shell fire, villages half destroyed yet alive with gratitude. And they knew they had done something greater than any single battle could show. Operation Dragoon was not just a military success, it was a masterpiece of coordination. From the beaches of Cavalaire to the valleys of the Rhône, American and French soldiers had fought side by side, their flags flying together, their blood mixed in the same soil. The Americans had brought with them not only power, but promise. A promise that France would rise again. And as their convoys rolled northward, each town they liberated became another heartbeat of a nation reborn. But history, as it often does, chose to remember the North. Normandy became legend. The beaches of Omaha and Utah became symbols of Allied bravery, and the Southern invasion, though vital, slowly faded into the shadows of time. The men who had landed in Operation Dragoon returned home with little fanfare, their victory quiet, their sacrifice almost forgotten. They were not the faces on the newsreels or the names in the textbooks, yet without them, the liberation of France would have taken far longer and cost far more lives. In the months that followed, the ports of Marseille and Toulon became lifelines for the Allied advance into Germany. Thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food flowed through those docks, keeping the armies of freedom moving forward. General Patch and General de Lattre de Tassigny, once strangers from different nations, became brothers in arms, their troops united by shared suffering and triumph, proving that alliance was not built by politics alone, but by the courage of those who fight together. As the war ended and Europe tried to heal, the veterans of Dragoon carried with them memories of blazing skies, the cries of the wounded, and the faces of the people who had kissed their hands in gratitude. They spoke little of it, but deep down they knew they had changed the course of history for the United States Operation Dragoon was a statement of power and principle. It showed that liberation could come from many directions, that unity and strategy could turn the tide of war faster than force alone. And for France, it was the moment the tricolor rose again on southern soil, not lowered by occupation but lifted by hope, a symbol that the spirit of the French people had never been broken. Decades later, historians would look back and call it the forgotten invasion. Yet for those who were there, it was unforgettable. The sound of waves crashing against the Mediterranean coast, the roar of landing craft, the smoke, the courage, and the pride of knowing they had freed a land once thought lost. As the sun set over the calm waters where once thousands had stormed ashore, the memory of Operation Dragoon remained in the hearts of those who understood what it meant. That freedom, though often born in silence, is never truly forgotten.